if you don't get your light story right, you can never get your health story right. Now, infrared is about, red and infrared are about half of the light spectrum for the entire course of the day. From dawn till dusk, we can't see that light. And so we kind of forget that it's even around. But red and infrared are the major proportion of that light spectrum. And I just want to pin that as something very important to understand, because I'll cycle back to that later. And so the long wavelengths of light also interact with our body in really specific ways. And because they're longer wavelengths and less high energy, they tend to be much more anti-inflammatory, much more kind of healing. And so that spectrum of light has been very specifically oriented in the blue light spectrum. And so why would that be a problem for a human body? That master clock is setting up the rhythms in all of our peripheral tissues and organs. And it's really important that they're all running on time. The next most important kind of clock giver is our skin. And so again, if people are under artificial light environments and they're wearing singlet tops and shorts, there's a lot of messages coming in through their skin that if they weren't to go outside and kind of reset their clock rhythm with natural light, that could be a problem for their body. There's something called, predictive load, or, allostatic load, where our system is so energy efficient that when we do things often, it's like, okay, I know what she's going to do or he's going to do. I'm going to make sure that I've got the resources for that. And whether that habit that we have is really serving us in the greatest or not, our body does adjust to that continued rhythm. Just as a first step, if they don't do anything else, just that one step will help their biorhythms in their body and will help change the exchange of information that had previously been very disrupted to being less disrupted. The more that choice is activated and the less disruption there is, the easier it is then to start activating some other steps.
Okay, hello everybody. Welcome back to Health Alliance Australia's podcast. My name is Jeannie Rose Anchwatha, and I'll be your host today. Health Alliance Australia is a leading health advocacy organisation dedicated to honouring bodily autonomy and well-informed health choices. Today, our guest is Pia Kynock. Pia is a holistic health coach, and we are going to focus our discussion today. Well, actually, it's going to be a very broad discussion, but we're going to talk about light, circadian rhythm, emotional healing, and very spiritual aspects. We're going to enter into the very heart space of healing, because with Health Alliance, we've actually covered a lot of sort of very fundamental kind of topics in terms of supplements and drugs and bioweapons and all of that. But we're really going to expand all that knowledge and understanding as to what actually makes us human and how we can heal on a totally different plane. So Pia, I'd love it if you could introduce yourself. I know you do a lot of different things, very holistic in how you approach life, which is just amazing.
Yes, definitely. And I really wanted to show my eyes. I know that some people will be watching this on YouTube, and I do really want to put my blue blocking glasses on. So I am going to pop them on now as I introduce myself. So my name's Pia. I live in Melbourne on a farm. I have grown a huge amount over the evolution of my life journey. I've come from a really pretty dysfunctional background, and that dysfunctional background really led me into deeper understandings of myself so that I could serve other people. So I started off my wellness career as a skin therapist, beauty therapist, massage therapist, body worker. I got into energy therapies, neuro-linguistic programming. I started to recognize that people's thoughts were dictating so much of their response to all of the treatments that I was doing. And I obviously looked after a lot of women in those capacities, a little men, but definitely a huge percentage of my clients were women. And there was such a deep sense of unworthiness, not enoughness happening across all different spectrums of the socioeconomic groups that I was part of. And it really allowed me to go deeper and deeper and deeper into understanding the nervous system and what was happening inside of our body as a reflection of what's happening outside. And I started to look at the interconnectedness of life in deeper ways. And I definitely became much more of myself along my own journey as I broke, like every time I went into the darkest, deepest parts of a corner, then I I fixed myself in new ways, and I had new, deeper appreciations of myself. And along the journey, I just kept picking up learnings from different masters from around the globe. And I added things like mindfulness training and breath work and acupressure and Reiki. And then I decided that I needed to study functional nutrition. Then I decided I needed to get my naturopathy degree. I've done a lot of nervous system training, trauma-informed training, somatic psychotherapy training. And then I got into quantum biology. So looking at the aspects of light and water and magnetism and these kind of fundamental smallest particles of us and how they are interacting to drive either health or disease. And then I kind of brought in all of these different holistic aspects to look at what I call ecosystem interconnectedness, ecosystem wellness. You know, we're not alone or isolated in this journey. We are constantly connecting, you know, within all of our different inner realms, whether we're conscious of them or not, and all of the different outer realms, you know, all the different people, places, situations, things, emotions, all the microbiomes, all the plants, all the animals. It is all interconnected, and I love unraveling the pieces that make the biggest difference to health. So that's a little bit about my journey.
Yeah, I mean, I think, you know, we were talking about this in the beginning. I think, you know, when you look at, say, the whole gamut of YouTube and online world, often it's there to sell a particular idea, just one small bit of the puzzle. And so, for example, usually when people get sick, in the traditional sense, they would have gone to a doctor and they would have got some sort of drug and they would mask their symptoms and they would, you know, carry on with life. And that would be considered um, treatment working. Like that would be, they would assess how whether something worked based on whether their symptoms subsided. And then we've kind of moved now, a lot of people sort of moved now to, okay, we think that drugs are toxic. And so therefore we're going to avoid those. But then now we're going to introduce things like supplements or certain various modalities without actually going and doing that inner work of emotional healing and kind of working out your connections to other relationships, to the land, which is all encompassing, really. You know, if we poison the land around us, then we can't be healed ourselves. So why are we poisoning the land? And it all comes down to, I guess, to self-love and to this bigger, wider picture of the heart space, which is where I think, you know, for this particular podcast, I'd like to take us into this idea to broaden people's understanding of what it is to actually heal on a real cellular level, because it's not just taking a particular supplement or just doing a certain modality. It is a journey, essentially, you know. So we were going to start off, and I noticed when you actually, we'll start with something that's familiar to what people know. When
Well,
you,
actually, Jenny, now that because you just did that, can we just segue slightly? What I'd love to is actually make
okay,
a
yep,
clear
sure.
example of that to people. For all the people listening right now, whether you're standing, driving, sitting, however you're interacting with listening right now, maybe just take a moment to notice your body. And when I say notice your body, can you notice your feet on the floor? Can you notice the feeling of your legs underneath you? I'm sitting, so I'm pressing into my legs right now. I'm feeling that strength. And as I do that, I'm able to kind of elongate up through my spine. And if everyone could just imagine that, you know, there was a cord from the top of your head and you were pulling it up, how would that be to just allow a little bit more length in your body? Maybe you want to have a slight tuck of your chin, and maybe all of this kind of subtle rearrangement allows you to feel more open across your chest. And then just notice one breath. You don't need to change it. And then I'm just going to invite in just a movement of your own breath where you're doubling the length of your exhale. So no matter the length of your inhale, just take a few moments to double the length of your exhale and repeat that just a few times. And that exhale is like a beautiful signal of creating some space inside and outside. And then I just want to take a moment just to offer a little intention. I'm going to call in the 4 directions, the 4 seasons, the 4 life cycles, and the 5 elements, and all beings of the highest light and the highest love that have walked with us in this life and all lives, calling in the original custodians on each of the lands on which we're all sitting, working, playing right now, and allowing that information to hold space for us in this conversation. And just taking one more breath where you exhale maybe even slower than before. And maybe there is just as even a small recognition that there is something greater than you going on in life. And I mean, I think that maybe took 30 seconds, maybe 45 seconds. It doesn't take long just to create small but subtle shifts in our awareness of ourselves in time and space. And I feel like those sort of small practices can make significant differences in journeys. And of course, you can layer them. There's many other aspects that I like to weave in, but just a small little intentional connection to body, noticing of breath, and just calling in what we are. Like, we can turn and face any direction. We're created of the elements. We are of the earth. We do move through life cycles, like we're all at different times in our life, we're starting fresh. Like, we feel like a baby. We might change jobs or start learning something new. We're basically a baby in that stage. We've got to learn to walk and then be a teenager and then an adult, and then we start the whole process again. And so it's not about chronological age. It's just kind of about where we're at in our learning and development and evolutionary cycles. And I think that's a beautiful thing to recognize, witness, and appreciate.
Wow, Pia, that's beautiful. It really is. And I think it's now we've kind of gone a different train. We're just going to abandon the script. We're just going to
No script.
So what I'm thinking was it's really appropriate what you're saying now. My dad passed away last week. So, it's that sort of finding that space and how do you actually, feel and sit with all of those, very strong emotions. And often in life, we're living inside our head space and we're constantly trying to find more and more information. And I found that even in my own healing journey, you're bombarded with so much information, but what is the right decision for you? And you're not people aren't tuning into that intuitive space to know. So they're sort of trying a whole lot of different things without actually kind of assimilating all of that
Oh, hands up.
knowledge.
Hands up for me. Number one, I also just wanted to say that's a big transition. Thank you for sharing. And I just really want to honor the space that you've been in and all of the different unravelings that occur when there's a transition from physical realm to an energetic realm. So yeah, I'm sending you lots of love.
Thank you.
And I also know that I was definitely one of those people that was really busy collecting information. And that was partly due to my nervous system response. I was really stuck in flight mode for a very long time. And we can talk about nervous system responses later. But basically what that means is I couldn't stop doing. I was doing all over myself because I didn't feel comfortable with my inner formation. And if you think about the word information, and then you think about the inner formation, to collect information, but to not rearrange your inner formation means that it never really embodies. And to reorganize an inner formation, I believe that that's where we've really got to feel. We have to feel the difference. We need to be inspired to be able to navigate new changes inside of our perceptions, our awareness of reality, and who we are, like what our identity is. Like, each time I've been through a paradigm shift, I do need to hold space for grieving all past versions of self. And that grief is, in that recognition of all the things that did happen to me that I didn't deserve, or that didn't happen to me that I did deserve. The work of Dr. Joan Rosenberg, I just want to shout her out. And for a long time, I was just gathering lots of information because I didn't have capacity to grieve. I had never been taught emotional regulation or being able to sit with my own body. I was navigating my young and adult life experience based upon the experiences of my family network, my peer network, and I wasn't hanging out with people who knew what regulation was. It was really chaotic and it was really intense. And so I lived my life in flight response as a response to that. But learning responsibility allowed over and over the information that I'd been collecting to finally feel into a place to land. And as I started to slow down, because I felt safe enough to slow down, safe enough to be in my body, safe enough to create and anchor in a sense of belonging in myself, then I moved into new layers of mastery, where when I share, I'm sharing from a deeply authentic place that I feel like if somebody else has a similar vibration, they can resonate with pretty quickly. And I believe that when we come together in these co-creative spaces and we feel resonance, oh my gosh, do we light each other up, and
Yeah.
that's where I believe that community and that collaboration, that's what does change the world. And I also know that for a lot of my life, I feel like my inauthentic expression blocked me from true intimacy, like that word into me see.
Yeah.
And that was when I was living with a lot of that sense of unworthiness. I felt like I was broken and unlovable and all of those things. I was constantly worried about rejection. Imposter syndrome was a huge thing for me. I showed up in lots of places, but I just never really believed myself. And so over and over again, I had to show up for the inner work, the commitment to myself. I had to forge a relationship with my body. And again, there's many different practices that can assist in that process, but there's no magic wand, there is no pill, there is no supplement, there is no one diet. And I do just want to land here and kind of pin that I do believe that if I'd learnt about circadian biology and circadian rhythms maybe first along in my journey, I'd be a very different person, but then we wouldn't be having this conversation.
Yes, I mean, that really does touch on our topic. I mean, I think when it comes down to the very basics, it's not really, there's no money in talking about it, right? So people aren't going to talk about circadian rhythm. They're not going to talk about sleep cycles and even nutrition to some degree. I mean, they can sell books and so forth, but they're not going to say, oh, here's a rough outline of, not just how you eat mindfully, but the gratitude that you put within that food. Like if you're going to be stressed and, eating, then that's not going to be very helpful at all. And I think too, gathering information becomes a bit of an obsession. So what happens is we gather so much information 24/7. We're, gathering more and more information. We're trying to assimilate all of that. And of course, the internet is, there's so much out there. But then in a way, what happens is, how do you stop and decide what information you're going to implement at all? Because there's always something more that you're going to learn. And so when you
This is where people avoid feeling. They go into mental states rather than emotional states. And so that's just one big differentiating factor. If you're still just thinking and you're analytical and you're logical, I feel like it's just one of the ways in which we block ourselves from actually dropping in to how that information has landed.
Yeah, and I think what happens is not that it shouldn't be read or shouldn't be taken in, but when you step aside and you pause, like you've just helped us all moment there, and think, how do I feel? Then you can actually assess yourself what changes you need to make. And they're often just small changes every day. And eventually you get to a certain path where you're a totally different person. Because I think this whole idea of constant, like a drastic change can be a bit of a shock to the system. So, you make these small changes. And when you're thinking probably one of the primary, so if you want to, let's talk about that first, about why it's important, in terms make all the other changes. Finding this, what has changed for you in terms of, I mean, we talk about it. We wanted to talk to our listeners, your definition of it.
Hey, sweetheart, I've got the gist of what you were saying, but I felt like our connection just dropped in and out a little there. So I didn't quite grasp that entire.
Okay, my connection. So basically, let's talk about circadian rhythm, what it is, and in terms of why it's foundational to healing.
Totally. And even I would like to link this even to the dopamine and dopamine addictions and why we constantly go back to that needing stimulus and how that is actually interrelated to light. And so, I mean, if everyone just took a moment to think about the age of this planet, it's about 4 billion years old. And part of how this planet has evolved is with light and darkness as a fundamental foundational aspect. Despite all of the different extinction events that happened across our planet and different levels of gases and minerals and all of that kind of stuff, what this planet has had the entire time is rhythms of light and dark. So across the entire evolutionary history of this world, that's what, from the smallest microbe all the way up to the most complex organism, we have all adapted to be with those light cycles, to respond to those light cycles, whether we're diurnal animals or nocturnal animals, you know, or plants respond to light and dark. Every aspect of this world does. And so the light that is emitted from the sun has a full spectrum. And I'm going to speak about that full spectrum first, and then I'm going to speak about what's happened, you know, with human evolution over the last kind of 120 years and how that's changed how we've interacted with this full spectrum of light. So we've got the different UV lights, UVC, UVB, UVA. We can't see them, but we have lots of different proteins in our eyes and on our skin and elsewhere in our body that respond to these lights. We've got lots of carriers of light information in our system that also respond to these cues of light. Then we've got the visible light spectrum. So, you know, that goes from, you know, it's the Roy G. Biv. So violet, indigo, blue, you know, this is coming from the UV side, violet, indigo, blue, green, yellow, orange, red. And then we move into the infrared spectrum, the very long wavelengths. So what I want to share particularly here is that from the UV side, that's very short, high energy wavelength light. And through the blue spectrum of the visible wavelength, that's still, because it's quite close to UV, very high energy wavelengths. The higher energy wavelength something is, the more excitation there is in our body. Like, you've got to respond to high energy with high energy. Yeah. Like that. I think everyone kind of gets the basic premise of that theory. And then as we move into, you know, like the greens and the oranges and the reds, and then the infrared spectrum, the wavelengths get much, much longer. Now, infrared is about, red and infrared are about half of the light spectrum for the entire course of the day. From dawn till dusk, we can't see that light. And so we kind of forget that it's even around. But red and infrared are the major proportion of that light spectrum. And I just want to pin that as something very important to understand, because I'll cycle back to that later. And so the long wavelengths of light also interact with our body in really specific ways. And because they're longer wavelengths and less high energy, they tend to be much more anti-inflammatory, much more kind of healing. I'm just going to use that word. Not that the UVA and UVB lights aren't healing, but the longer wavelengths tend to be much more soothing, you know, like it's just that kind of, you know, like gentle lapping of the shore rather than crashing waves, you know. And so all parts of our body interact with that entire spectrum of light. And so coming back to this conversation about what changed in human evolutionary history 120 years ago was the introduction of the electricity network and light globes. And so humans, for the first time ever, I mean, apart from with fire and candlelight, we were in charge of our light in new ways that we'd never had before. And then we had the introduction of much higher energy globes around about, you know, 60 years ago. And from then, the globes have been developed to become more energy efficient over time. And I just, for those that are just listening, I put that in inverted commas, because basically the higher the energy efficiency, you know, for technology, the less energy efficient it is for a human body. And I'll explain more about that as we go on. The issue has been with not just the electrical circuits, which, you know, are related to EMF exposure, and I'll park that as well and come back to that later. But the issue has been with the development of globes over time, is that the spectrum of light has become more and more and more narrow as light globes have been developed. And so that spectrum of light has been very specifically oriented in the blue light spectrum. And so why would that be a problem for a human body? Well, number one, in that blue light spectrum, it's very high energy. As I said before, it's like right next to the UV range on that wavelength index. But it's also in an indoor environment, we don't have any of the red or the infrared, those longer wavelengths to help balance it out and create any smoothing or soothing or anti-inflammatory actions in our system. So what our skin and our eyes have been dealing with for quite a long time now is this blue energy light, which chews through a whole lot of ingredients in our system, leaving much less ingredients for other processes related to repair and rejuvenation. And so we can see a beautiful correlation, well, beautiful, not beautiful, beautiful because we know about it now, correlation between light exposure and disease risk, like higher mortality and morbidity rates across the lifespan. And they absolutely unequivocally know now that artificial light exposure at night is related to obesity and cardiovascular risk, and particularly breast and prostate and colorectal cancers, but other cancers, mitochondrial dysfunction, basically. And so it's a really significant conversation, and one that when I learned about it, I was like, oh my gosh, this has never been addressed in any of my learning. And this is what I consider to be fundamental. If you don't get your light story right, you can never get your health story right. It doesn't matter what other interventions you're choosing. That's a really important thing to land. And so the other aspect of the blue light that's impacting our body and our system and our sleep in huge ways is that blue light, particularly in the wavelength that our technology offers us, suppresses melatonin. It does also make us, it's meant to make us more alert and more cognitive adaptive, because, normally across the course of our day, we've got a little bit of blue light that comes out at dawn, and then we get more and more over the course of the day. So it's solar noon, we've got the highest amount of blue light that we've got, and we're quite active in the middle of the day. That's when humans are normally running around doing the most amount of things. And then you get less and less blue light over the course of the day. But most people are interacting with overhead lights or phone lights, screen lights, from early in the morning to late at night. And so our blue light receptors in our skin and our body have evolved to notice blue light and be particularly heightened to that aspect of when it gets to solar noon. And so all of our other rhythms are kind of aligned to what time it is, depending on what light information we're receiving. So if we're constantly receiving a blue light energy wavelength, our body is basically aligning that to being, okay, it must be solar noon. That's quite a confusing signal. Would you agree? Like
Yeah. I mean,
from
it's
the
so you
early.
basically, yes, you're saying that we're being kept in a fight and flight response
Mhm.
and completely active. It's like we're sort of energized, the batteries just continuously going. And I think it's an interesting point that you raised, that it peaks at noon, because traditionally that's when you were supposed to eat your largest meal, because digestion requires such a high amount of energy. And yet we're doing it all kind of backwards, really, and we're using and expending a lot of energy when you think about how many lights we're under, constantly
Mm.
from the start of the day. And especially when you've got your phones, like we're looking at these blue screens, it's coming straight through our eyes,
Mm.
which is how we're receiving light mostly by, and then we're getting it's a pollution essentially,
Yeah.
because it's in such a toxic range. I mean, we're allowed to get so much of it, but we haven't evolved to do that. Like, if you think about it.
We'll also think about the fact that at solar noon, we would also have, that would be the height of UVA and UVB exposure as well. And so what happens when we're under those kind of lights? Well, we have a lot of nitric oxide production in our skin, which is fantastic for our cardiovascular system. And, like we get hot, we notice that the higher UVB index there is, depending on your skin type and the intensity, whether you're in the shade or actually in the direct light, that's when vitamin D production happens. But if you stay in UVB too long, you might burn. Yeah. And so that would be when blue light's at its highest. We've got these other indicators in our environment, in that natural light spectrum. We've got the red and the infrared that are creating repair and healing while all of this is going on. But we also have all of these noticeable differences in our body, where after an amount of time, and each person's going to have a different amount of time, they'd be like, okay, I'm too hot, or I am burning. I'm going to get out. I want to avoid the sun now in this process. I want to get out of this high spectrum energy light. And so what we don't have in an artificially lit environment is we've got this amazing spectrum of blue light, very high energy, which creates a lot of oxidative stress in the skin. The greater the oxidative stress, the greater the lipid peroxidation, the greater the DNA damage. And we don't have any other mechanisms to help us understand that we've had too much, too fast, too soon, and too little resources for too long is the definition of a trauma response. And why I believe that melanoma rates are rising across the world, even though like Slip Slop Slap campaigns are so huge, is not related to the UV exposure. It's people's incorrect understanding of how to form a relationship with the sun, and the high intensity of blue light exposure that we're receiving, and the fact that a lot of people don't use SPF properly. It's not designed to prolong our time in the sun. It does also block the UV rays, so we're not getting a lot of that signaling going on, but we're still getting an intense amount of the visible light spectrum. high energy blue light if we're in solar noon. And so people, I feel like, have demonized UV light. And, you know, a lot of the studies that have been done with UV light have been done in isolation. They're not looking at the full solar spectrum. They're just looking at the, you know, narrow UV bands. And of course, they've got detrimental effects. But there also hasn't been enough studies looking at the oxidative stress effects of just blue light on things like skin cancers. Those studies are starting to come. But I think it's
I think really it's sort of like common sense, really, isn't it? We were evolved to work with nature, not against it. But at this point, I think it's quite an interesting point to raise about vitamin D, since we've sort of inserted here a little bit, was this kind of movement now to have sort of high dose vitamin D to fix this light deficiency, and why that is not really the answer. And in fact, I've been to a few, I've spoken to a few. So one of the lectures I went to yesterday actually was talking about keeping your minerals in your body in balance. So it was by the Melty Institute. And what he was saying was, if you've got adrenal burnout, if you take calcium and vitamin D, or something that's high in vitamin calcium, like dairy with vitamin D, you'll end up with a health disaster and calcification, because your calcium levels are already high, and you know your stress uses up magnesium. So it's sort of interesting that, and then we also got our interview with Dr. Garrett Smith, where he talks about vitamin D as an oxidized form of cholesterol. And oxidized usually means damage, and a specific form of cholesterol that is oxidized in the skin, and we absorb it, and we say it's an essential vitamin. But vitamin D is actually, he believes, to be a remnant of being in the sun. And when you have excessive amounts have been given to children in dairy fortification, it's actually killed them. It stores in the liver and causes fatty liver disease and toxicity at high doses. So I'm thinking it's very interesting that this movement here to look at the results of having sunshine, which is vitamin D in the skin, and then say, okay, we'll supplement in vitamin D. But that doesn't actually fix the problem. And the problem being that we are light beings, and we need that full spectrum in the right time, in the right order to live.
Of course, and there's a few things to this conversation. Number one, skin health is a really big one. And again, like, there's a lot of different ingredients that go into making a really good skin barrier, same as any of the barriers in our body. And, you know, if we don't have a really good skin barrier, it is a little harder to create vitamin D. And we absolutely need vitamin D. As we all know, like, the lower, you know, your vitamin D levels are inside your body, the greater your risk of dying and disease. Like, that is absolutely, you know, it's been studied a lot. And so vitamin D is involved and regulates over, you know, like, thousands of gene expressions in our body. And there's not just one type of vitamin D. You know, there's 17 different variations across our lifespan and through food sources of vitamin D. I mean, there's one type of food source, but all these different variations of vitamin D that interact with our body. So when we have that photo excitation on the surface of our skin, which we have designed to, like, that's what we were designed to have, that photo excitation has a whole lot of other signaling that's going on in our bodies at that time. And that vitamin D is absolutely necessary for every single process in our body that is protective. And taking vitamin D supplementation, they've done lots of studies on this, it doesn't fix the problem. So what they notice is that they're not getting the results, you know, for disease risk or for mortality risk just with vitamin D supplementation. And that's because the people aren't receiving the light, and they're not receiving the different wavelengths of light that would also be present if we were with UVB. And, you know, like, if you tried to estimate the, you know, there'd be trillions of slightly different wavelengths of light from that UV side all the way to that infrared side. Like, there's so much light happening in the natural environment, plus the reflection of infrared from all of the plants, the green, the nature that we're designed to continually receive. And science can never replicate that. And a supplement can never replicate that. And that's a really underestimated factor when it comes to people's health. And I feel that if people were to understand that their interactions with light were determining all aspects of their health, I think it would make it easier to decide that a supplement that's trying to replicate the sunlight is never going to work as well. And I also believe the same about, you can biohack your way if you do have an indoor or device heavy lifestyle. Yes, like I've got blue blockers on. Yes, I've just had a red and infrared light on my feet where we started this presentation to offset some of that. I am sitting on an infrared mat while we're talking. Like, I do live a very modern life, and I do have a device heavy life, and I've got lots of different, tech strategies to help me. I also spend a huge amount of time outside to ensure that, in between sessions, my body actually recognizes what the real time is, the time that's related to the dawn, dusk, solar noon, and nighttime cues. And the more that my body recognizes what the real time is, the more my inner clocks will be running on time. And I haven't spoken about the clock system yet, and maybe that's where we should go next.
Yeah, let's go.
Okay, so basically in our eyes and also on our skin, we have these receptors for light, but I'm going to focus mainly on our eyes. So it's very, very important when we are interacting with natural light to not have anything covering our eyes, because if we have contacts on, if we have sunglasses on, if we have prescription glasses on, we do have a barrier to receiving that full spectrum of light. Yeah. And so that's one of the most important, ways to start is kind of bare eyes, bare skin. And so when we interacting with light, we have these rods and cones in our eyes that help us, the cones are for color vision, the rods are for low light vision, but we also have opsins that are very much picking up the blue light spectrum. And that information is traveling down something called the retinal hypothalamic tract, all the way to a special part of our brain next to the hypothalamus called the suprachiasmatic nucleus, which you can just kind of call the SCN. You could also just call it the master clock. Basically, that light information is so special that our body has been designed to pass it straight through this direct line of communication into this master clock to set up the timing. And that timing then sends a whole lot of messages to all of our different hormones, our hormone, like the releasing hormones, other hormones, all other aspects of our body are like, oh, great, it's 7 o'clock in the morning. Or, say it's 6 o'clock in the morning. We're going to start decreasing melatonin and increasing our cortisol curve. We're going to start getting insulin ready for that first ingestion of food. We're going to start increasing the detox capabilities of the liver for that potential ingestion of food. We're going to shift our immune profile right now. All of these things start to go on in our body in the expectation of what time it is and what we're going to be doing over the course of the day. And so this master clock is particularly attuned to light signals, and there are some other signals called zeitgebers or time givers that I'll also mention, like exercise, stress, noise, temperature, the Earth's EMF. They're also time givers. Food quality, quantity, and the time of eating is like kind of the second most important signal. But the light is the number one trainer of our master clock. And I like to make this example. Can you imagine if you went to an airport and they set up all the times of the flights, and the times of the flights is known because someone knows the real time. Somebody knows exactly what the time is. And so all of the flights are running on time, all the passengers, all the luggage, like everything is kind of running to these little streams of what the time actually is. If that master clock was off, or a few of the other clocks started doing their own things, you could imagine that pretty quickly that airport would be in complete chaos. And the more that went on, if that happened day after day after day after day, there would be banks of traffic and rubbish and stressed out people. And, that region would be having some big issues because this master clock wasn't running on time in the airport. And so that's kind of what's happening in a lot of people's bodies, because we're giving incorrect light cues that aren't related to natural light through this track through our eye to set up the rhythm of our master clock. That master clock is setting up the rhythms in all of our peripheral tissues and organs. And it's really important that they're all running on time. The next most important kind of clock giver is our skin. And so again, if people are under artificial light environments and they're wearing singlet tops and shorts, there's a lot of messages coming in through their skin that if they weren't to go outside and kind of reset their clock rhythm with natural light, that could be a problem for their body. Yeah. And when it comes to the timing of food, this is one of the reasons why people kind of wreck their clock system is because they might be eating late at night. Maybe they did skip breakfast. Maybe they did have caffeine. Caffeine can change our clock rhythms and our clock systems, and it can also change our pupil size, changing the way that we interact with light. And if we're drinking a coffee and looking at our phone, we're interacting with that light in a very extreme way. It's creating an energy deficiency, if that makes sense. And when people eat late at night, they're also kind of resetting their clock rhythm because they're eating so late. The clocks inside of our gut say to the brain, oh, we're not actually running to the time that you said that we were running to. We need to change the rhythm. You do get a little increase in cortisol that suppresses your melatonin. When that person goes to bed, if there's any light in their environment, our skin and our eyes are so sensitive to even one photon of light, which one photon of light is energy, it's information, that will shift our ability to be able to have a very restorative sleep. It will shift our ability to, drop into REM sleep, and, the quality and quantity of our sleep will be changed. That melatonin that we're meant to produce at nighttime is also cancer suppressive. It's an antioxidant, it's an anti-inflammatory. So we're missing out on all of these benefits that would normally happen. It also helps our mitochondria go through their fission and fusion processes so that they're kind of restoring their communication and harmony. And our mitochondrial network are like our social, environmental biosensors in our body. The better they're communicating and the better their energy flow, the better we're operating and the better our energy flow. So if we're missing out on these components at nighttime, it's going to be almost impossible to really regather your energy and your authenticity and your sense of belonging in yourself, because you will be running on a stress-based program.
Yeah, and of course, in terms of a biochemical thing, you're depleting magnesium and you're getting out of balance. And one thing that is interesting about the body is its ability to kind of adapt. And what happens, I think, over time is we develop these habits and we can just literally get into the wrong rhythm. And then it takes a bit of effort, I think, to reset again, to go back to that natural rhythm. I mean, I've heard, people do things like you have to go out camping, perhaps even to really break some of these particular habits of how we've all gets into very bad habits. I mean, how do you manage all that?
I did a post on this morning on my Facebook page. Actually, I said that it's challenging to get well in the environment that you became sick in. However, what I really wanted to land in that post was that our inner environment is the one environment that we have the most choice and control over. And so if you have to start somewhere, just noticing your posture, your breath, and your alignment to light cues, three of the, in my perspective, fastest and easiest ways to create a new calibration. I haven't really spoken about posture or breath yet, but that has a lot to do with our response to light and even how our skin responds to light. I just want to drop in that our nervous system is listening to everything the whole time, listening to things that we don't even understand. Like, how many volatile, compounds are coming off my wallpaper right now? What's the temperature in the room? What is my breath rate? What is my heart rate? How much saliva is in my mouth? What's my pH in my blood? What's my pH in my gut? What might be happening next? There's something called predictive load or, allostatic load, where our system is so energy efficient that when we do things often, it's like, okay, I know what she's going to do or he's going to do. I'm going to make sure that I've got the resources for that. And whether that habit that we have is really serving us in the greatest or not, our body does adjust to that continued rhythm. And our body does love rhythms. And so again, if I can help someone set up a new rhythm in their life, and that rhythm might be just seeing morning light. Can you eat your breakfast outside? Or even if you still want to drink coffee and not eat, could you just take it outside? Could you take your first phone call outside? Could you not have your phone right next to your head? There's a few different strategies that we can implement just to start somewhere. And when we began our conversation, I did invite in a noticing of posture. And for anyone that maybe started that and maybe they realized that they were a little bit slumped or hunched over, there's a few different things going on. When our posture it's more of a defensive posture, like you've kind of come in, you're curled in more on yourself. And I see a lot of human beings in the world that I interact with in this exact posture, whether they're walking around or sitting down. That's going to change how much oxygen comes into our system. It's going to change the way our mitochondria are functioning. It's also going to change us into more of a stress-based response. That stress response isn't just inside our body, it's also on our skin as well. And again, these are just small things that change the way that we interact with light and even with other people. So just shifting the posture to becoming more aware of where my feet are in time and space, whether I can kind of lift my body up, straighten my head, allow my gaze to be, up and alert. These small noticings can shift not just our physiology, but our psychology. In that small space of awareness, then you could drop into a couple of breaths. As you notice your breath again, you notice a little more of your body. And I certainly know that with all of my practices and how I work with my clients, is that the more of our body that we can connect to and belong to in any moment, the less we belong to the stresses of the outside world or other people's opinions. The more that we can connect to that felt sense of us in any moment, the more empowered we are. We do walk differently, we do talk differently, because we're not belonging to things outside of ourselves. Did that make sense?
Yeah, and I think you can sort of just adopt these little practices within your own life. So, you can just say, okay, I'm feeling stressed, or I'm going to do this before some big event. I'm going to go and breathe. I'm going to do 100 breaths or whatever. You might want to start small, because
I think starting small and consistent, it's consistency over perfection every time. And I truly do believe that if people were to just start accessing morning light, just as a first step, if they don't do
Mm,
anything else, just that one step will help their biorhythms in their body and will help change the exchange of information that had previously been very disrupted to being less disrupted. The more that choice is activated and the less disruption there is, the easier it is then to start activating some other steps. If
yeah.
people to change their artificial light exposure at nighttime, literally just by changing the angle of the overhead lights. And I didn't speak about this before, but if you think about like from dawn to dusk, where the angle of the sun is, if you can as closely match that in your indoor environment as you go over the course of your day, that's just another really easy thing to do. Because if it's 7 o'clock at night and you've got a light that's directly over your head, it's kind of a signal for your system saying it's midday again. Yeah. And so
Mm.
just noticing the angle of the lights and how similar is that to the outside landscape, whether I have to be inside or not, I still have control over my environment to some degree. And
I mean, you,
see,
you can get these lights these days that do mimic the sun. I've got one of them, my daughter. They're quite expensive, but you flick them and it changes the intensity of the light. I mean, it's artificial still, but it dulls the blue light.
totally, you can get amber globes, red globes. You can have, lamps set up on the floor so that, once the sun's gone down, you've got lighting that's low to the ground. You've got red and orange blue blocking glasses that you can wear at nighttime. Like if you kind of don't have any overhead lights on, if that's possible,
Mm.
that's just a really easy strategy. If you do have to turn them on, could you navigate? Like maybe you could wear a hat, or you've got the blue blocking glasses just to help your body out as much as you can in the environment that you have to be in. And so it's a really small but subtle shift that makes
Yeah.
huge difference over time. And you can get UV lights that say in wintertime, that they were originally intended for SAD, seasonal affective disorder. You can get lights that help you build your own vitamin D production. And yes, they are biohacking tools, but if you've got to start somewhere and if that's all you have available to you, yes, you can. The other thing I want to speak about is brightness. So if you look at like the lux, the intensity of the brightness of natural sun, say from dawn, it's like say 1,000 to 3,000 lux, and at the midday it could be anywhere between 10,000 and 100,000 lux, depending on where you are and the brightness, and whether there's clouds, environmental pollutants, all of that kind of thing. A natural, like a normally lit indoor environment is about 400 to 500 lux, even in a very brightly lit room. So although the color of the light is in that blue light spectrum and that is impacting us, our body's also not receiving like the cues of the brightness, the lux intensity that we are meant to be involved with as well. And so it's just another way that it's confusing for our system, and another reason why it's important to get outside in any break that you can possibly get. And even if you're driving in the car, have the windows down. If you are in a windowed environment, I just want to remind everyone again, with modern technology and energy efficiency in buildings, what they block out is UV light and infrared spectrum. So it's visible light enriched. If it's visible light enriched, you're in another blue light enriched environment, yeah, but without any of the helpful red and infrared rays. and without any of the signaling that comes from the UV side. So, you know, you can be in an inside environment with lots of windows and you're still not receiving all of the signals that perhaps you used to think that you were. And so even just opening a window is better than not having it open at all.
And I think, of this comes, the workplaces that we are with will kind of adopt new practices with light. I think it's just raising this awareness of how important light is to our overall health and well-being. And of course, mentally, I think there's also that aspect of, mental health is very related with the light spectrum, that when, people just naturally feel when they go for a walk and they don't need to take all the drugs or even coffee. For example, sometimes when people wake up and they're tired, they just reach automatically for coffee. But I found that I go for a weekly walk, and when I get up, I'm tired, and sometimes I can't be bothered going, but then I've got this commitment to myself that I'll go on this particular walk after. I just feel so energized, because of
It's
taking
so
in that light. So it's opposite of what you think you need. When you're tired, you need to go out there and absorb all that light, and then you'll come back energized.
And I really get that it can be challenging, because I know that when people are blue light toxic, that there's something going on in their dopamine system, and usually they don't have very much DHA and they don't have very much vitamin A. Now, vitamin A deficiency is obviously related to immune issues, and it's also interrelated with obesity, and dopamine issues is a ubiquitous problem in our world. And there's also a lot of eye changes that I haven't spoken about. But, if you look at kids and myopia and obesity rates, I do believe that a lot of that is interrelated to light exposure and how close they are to screens. And when people have a dopamine deficiency and a cortisol dysregulation, which is what blue light toxicity does to us, of course, I get it. It can be it might seem overwhelming to be like, well, I don't have the energy for that. And that's why if I can get people just to start small by accessing the natural light in the morning and just maybe becoming aware of their posture while they're outside and doing that as often as possible, that's what increases capacity for the next steps to arrive. And I just wanted to remind everyone about that, because I often meet people when they're really overwhelmed and they've seen lots of other practitioners. I do hold quite unusual knowledge across a lot of different streams, and they're often they feel downtrodden and like they've seen heaps of specialists and no one's got any answers for them. And just activating a couple of different decisions around their light exposure could seem like a really big deal. And when they do activate it, things change pretty quickly. I do want to remind people about that. I do want to come back into this nutrient profile though. In our eyes and in our brain, we've got the highest amount of DHA, which is an omega, one of the omega-3 family, of any other place in our body. And so if people are, for instance, eating a very high omega-6 diet, which is very, very common in our modern world, very common in takeaway foods, processed foods, refined foods, number one, there's a rancidity aspect related to that. So there's a lot more lipid peroxidation or oxidative stress that can come along with those omega-6s, but it often means that people are deficient, not just in omega-3s, but particularly DHA. And when we're deficient in DHA, it does mean that our eyes are on the back foot when it comes to receiving light signals, but our brain is on the back foot for passing on those signals and organizing our system. So that's just something to be aware of. Vitamin A also, like that's a part of every single light receptive protein in our body. And so if we're deficient in vitamin A, that's going to be a really big problem for the way that we interact with light. And if we are under a lot of blue light, that's because it's such a high energy bandwidth, it does take a lot of energy, and it will break down that vitamin A that is present. It will break down that DHA that is present. It will force dopamine production through our eyes. And if we're having a lot of dopamine production in our eyes, I'm sure you can imagine that that's taking up a lot of different ingredients that could be used in our brain networks. And if we're using a lot of nutrients just to deal with blue light toxicity, as I mentioned before, it does block us then from healing protocols later. And there is that interrelationship. I don't know if you know about aromatic amino acids, but they drive a lot of our neurotransmitter synthesis. So we've got phenylalanine and tyrosine that are involved in dopamine production and our thyroid hormones, and we've got tryptophan that ends up being converted to serotonin and then to melatonin. And so sometimes people are really protein deficient in their diets, or because they've got microbiome dysbiosis, their microbes can't make it, or if they've got glyphosate exposure, their microbes can't make those aromatic amino acids for us. And that will tap us out of our light story as well. So it's not just one thing, like
Yes, yes.
you've got to build on the process, but at least if you start accessing the biorhythm and harmonies that the natural morning light cues set up for you, at least you've got a window into the next steps.
Yeah, and I think that it creates that awareness of what you actually need, because as humans, we tend to do things that we feel like we need to do. And when you step into that power, you suddenly realize, my goodness, my body is actually quite amazing. I mean, I think that's the first thing people have to know, is that inside their body is this ability to do amazing things. Like as women, for example, we can give birth and create another being within us. And
Mm.
even that whole process, when we're talking about this, I was thinking how usually in order to give birth, say animals would go to a dark place alone in solitude, and they would easily give birth. But instead, where modern humans have gone is they've gone to a place that's foreign, like a hospital, birth center. It's
Under
all lit. They put them on the not but like the mainstream, that
Totally.
um, and it's very unnatural, right? So we're trying to get people to understand that where we are is into this kind of natural world, to work with nature and be one with it. And then all of these processes of our body just come back into alignment, just like a plant that has been planted in good soil with good nourishment and water will naturally flourish on its own without, much attention. In fact, that our bodies are designed to be self-healing, self-cleaning mechanisms, and light is such an important part of that. Everyone wants to talk about, obviously 5G is not the greatest, but then we're not even thinking about the things that we can actually control within our own environment, and that's our light toxicity.
Totally. And I mean, 5G, the Internet of Things, I mean, from 1G to 5G, it's still within that kind of radio wave, microwave spectrum. It's still light energy and information. And because it's biphasic, it's very different to the non-linear natural EMF exposure that we have also evolved with over the course of our lifespan. And if people can be a voice for shifting that, I do believe that that is a huge, huge part of what's going on. I mean, it's also related to hydration, because EMFs do change the hydration capacity of our body. It changes our redox potential. It particularly impacts mitochondrial function because of that change in redox potential. That changes our energy, and it changes our cognition. It changes how we can think critically. It changes our ability to focus. It's a way to keep people dumb, in my opinion. And it's
Yes.
definitely something to think about. But, when you were speaking about, women, having the power to give birth, I also just want to briefly mention that there's been a huge focus in health on our nuclear DNA, which is much more linear. It's that double helical spiral, but we have a whole nother DNA set in our cells, in our mitochondria, that a lot of people haven't had enough recognition of yet. And that mitochondrial DNA is circular, it's round. And if you think about that, like the concepts of, masculine energy and feminine energy, masculine energy has often been related to being quite linear, directive, focused, that leadership, confidence. And feminine energy is very much interrelated to non-linear, circle, flowing, sensual, passionate, dancing, doesn't really make a lot of sense, follows intuition, like that is a
Yeah.
beautiful marriage, and they have to support each other inside of our cells. And the nuclear DNA is intimately affected by mitochondrial DNA. So, I mean, I had a fascination with epigenetics for a while because I carry the MTHFR polymorphism, and I thought that for a long time that was why I was such a mess. And then I realized that mitochondrial function has a lot to do with it. Now, we inherit our mitochondrial DNA from our mothers. And if you look at the impact of human development over the course of the last 70 years, like we've had the introduction of the oral contraceptive pill, plastics exposure has gone up, endocrine disrupting chemicals have gone up massively, and our light environments have changed. Women, because of the choices that they had with their body, because of the pill, they were able to enter the workforce. So they had a lot more light exposure. Women's skin is thinner than a man's skin. Light exposure impacts us even more than a man. And that changed what was happening inside their mitochondria. Then they pass those messages on to their kids. Those epigenetic changes aren't just from our nuclear DNA, they're from our mitochondrial function as well. And this is why that readdressing what our relationship is to our body, and understanding that our body is made of earth, and how that might change our consumer choices and voices, is part of how we create a healing protocol. Like, the more isolated that any human being feels, the more that they feel like they're burdening, responsibilities, and, they're all alone and kind of woe is me, and I'm kind of a victim mindset. Of course, that is related to, some levels of truth for your experience of yourself, but regaining your own power means that you're showing up for yourself in new ways. And as you learn to show up for yourself, I believe that we also need to learn to show up for Mother Earth. And one way is that we start interacting with natural light, and all of a sudden we're interacting with nature again. And, even when I'm helping people with their digestive system, this might sound really, full on for some people, but I ask them to hop into child's pose on the earth and smell the soil. There is a huge microbiome exchange going on just with putting our head on the soil, like our skin contact, our breath contact close to Mother Earth will absolutely increase our microbial diversity. And it might mean that you're a bigger voice for asking your neighbor not to use Roundup or glyphosate. Like, please don't use weed killer, because you're killing the earth and my body and your family's body and your pet's body,
And it's a real a connection that you're, and at this point, I know you also do skin therapy or work with skin. And it's sort of interesting because when people think about skin, often in terms of women generally, they talk about it in like they don't want wrinkles. Yeah, it's all about youthfulness, and appearance. But here you're talking about skin in terms of a very functional role in terms of your body and your health. That it is the largest organ, and it's often, I think, quite neglected. We don't think about people aren't thinking about what they put on their skin or their skin's exposure to light. They're not thinking about the toxic clothes perhaps that they're putting on their skin. We know that it takes 26 seconds when you put a patch on for that to enter directly into the bloodstream. So, the skin is quite an amazing thing. It's not just a barrier, but it actually interacts with our blood supply. So I thought you
Totally.
want to talk about that. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. So again, like, we're covered in microbiome that likes to be diverse, and we've got different microbiome communities in different niches of our body, of our skin. Sorry, like my underarm microbiome diversity is different to the soles of my feet, is different to my face. And so when we're interacting with different products and or with light, that also changes our microbiome. And so even from the parts that we can't see, there are all of these different interactions that change my barrier formation. One interesting thing that I feel like a lot of people don't know about the skin is that they might have heard of our central stress response, our hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, that sets off, basically our stress hormones inside of us. Well, we have an analogous part in our periphery, in our skin. So our skin also is responding to cues of what it perceives as threats or safety all the time. And, one of the things about our skin is that we have a cell called the melanocyte, which produces melanin. Melanin interacts with the entire electromagnetic frequency spectrum. It interacts with light in particular ways. But our melanocytes also have an olfactory, like a smell-based response as well. Think about how many women cover themselves with perfume, or using laundry detergents that have smells on it or with it, and they're carrying that on their clothes. That's going to change that cell's response to what it's believing is cues of safety or danger. And so, perfume changes like the surface of our skin, and it can actually increase pigmentation because of the stress for melanocytes. But it's even just our ability to be able to interact with the smells of other human beings. If we're covering it up with synthetic based fragrances all the time, we're also missing whether we're very resonant with a person or not. And I feel like that can override our truth, our intuition that's literally held from skin to within. Our cells are meant to be vibrating in their own energy, and they're responding to other people's vibration. We put on synthetic things and it changes that vibration. Yeah. Does that make sense?
Yeah, look, I
And
mean, the smell is very important to our survival instinct, right?
yeah,
You
yeah,
know, we
absolutely.
we smell food, and there was this study, wasn't there, done about how when women took the pill, their sense of smell changed, and then they were attracted to the wrong sort of partners, and they went off the pill, and all of a sudden, the person that they were with didn't feel attractive anymore. So, it's interesting what you're saying here, where we're bombarded with smells all the time.
Mm,
Like, whether it's cleaning products or
mm.
um, products people
Parfums.
use aftershave, and
Yeah.
yet I think one of my daughters, after she was sick with And it's an interesting response with the whole COVID thing and losing people's sense of smell as one of the symptoms. Well, anyway, she recovered and she's now got such a heightened sense of smell that, we just walk into a certain shop and she just can't cope. It's just, it's because she can smell the toxicity of it. And it's warning us. It's essentially warning us and saying, hey, danger, and I have this feeling that, and they're actually trying to make vaccines to be inhaled. And there was this one case of an 11-year-old who his and he can't fit because he took a flu vaccine by the nasal spray. So it's in that they know that this particular region here is very, very important. It's
Well,
very
I also
important to our
just want to
survival.
I also want to point out, I don't know if you know this, but melanin is this incredible molecule that is also basically belongs to every family across this earth because we've been designed to interact with EMF exposure, natural light exposure. But we have melanin not just on our skin and in our eyes and in our hair, which is where most people know about it, but we've got it in our mouth. We've got it in our nose. We've got it in our ears. We've got it in like the middle of our brain. We've got a huge amount. It's in the substantia nigra of melanin sitting there. We've got melanin and melanocytes in our heart and in our gut. So we've got all of these different ways in which we are interacting with light and EMF. And if you think about the pandemic and obviously the stress changes our barrier formation. And as I just pointed out, all of those places that I just mentioned with melanin, melanocytes, they are part of our barriers. Yeah. Like there's a lot of different communication moving through our sensory organs. And we were inside, we were under a lot of EMF exposure, like human made, non-native EMF exposure. We weren't allowed outside. And then we had a lot of blue light toxicity. And I feel like that really interacted with our body. Of course, there was a different sort of nutrient deficiencies and excesses as well, and a lack of movement and digestive system function. Like I get it, but a lot of that was to do, in my opinion, with that excessive human-made EMF exposure and chronic blue light exposure that we were exposed to. And where did I want to go to with this? With the melanin that's sitting in nose and mouth and ears, if you also think about the artificial foods that have been very heavily processed that are missing out on the light codes that should have come from that region or that environment that you live in, like whatever region or environment you live in, if you're eating food that comes from your local area, you're receiving light codes from that food, particularly if you get it in pretty whole kind of forms and you don't muck around with it too much. But when people are having processed foods, those light cues could come from anywhere, but the more heavily refined it is, the more that light information and signaling is lost. And I believe that if we're not using our melanin, like any part of our body, we lose it. Yeah. And that's why Parkinson, neurodegenerative disorders, like there's a loss of melanin in our brain. But if you also think about earbuds and the chronic use of earbuds, particularly in kids, I believe that they're losing their melanin inside their ears because it's got to work so hard to deal with those non-linear, like those biphasic microwave signals that are basically, happening through their brain. So there are all of these different ways in which our system was designed to interact with light that modern life is basically disabling, that's keeping people sick and it's keeping people silly.
Yeah, I mean, and obviously we were like during the whole pandemic, we were like put in to our own little prisons. Some of them are much more attractive than others, but because we were, forced to stay home 23 hours of the day, and you couldn't obviously access a lot of sunlight. And even let's say you lived by whatever rules, it was like 1 or 2 hours. It wasn't really sufficient. But in some ways now, when the sort of like post-pandemic world, people sort of got used to this habit. I think, like with children especially, it was, I think, quite bad for them. You noticed after when people emerged, a lot of people had put on a lot of weight and were
Which is really
noticeably
light exposure.
more
The more weight,
more unhealthy.
natural
And
light exposure.
and I think when you're talking to you about breath work, whether you think that our exposure to light actually naturally regulates us taking in breath.
Well,
And
actually, yeah, artificial light exposure, particularly at night, changes our respiratory function and is related to sleep apnea, which is related to a whole lot of diseases and disorders. And so sleep apnea people focus on and they're like, let's give you a CPAP machine. Well, if you just actually rectified the artificial light exposure at night and also mitigated it during the day, you would most likely change that. And of course, I believe you need to work on posture, you need to work on fascia. Like there could be a whole lot of, jaw locking, tongue ties. Like a lot of people don't actually know how to biomechanically breathe properly. And I feel that when people keep going back to the basics, like what is it that my body's asking for? If someone's got sleep apnea or if they've got chronic snoring, what their body is moving into is a hypoxic state. And maybe that's because there's a mitochondrial dysfunction. Maybe their respiratory protein complexes have moved further apart from each other because there's such a big proton buildup because they're indoor, sedentary, man-made EMF exposure, DHA deficient. They can't make the cardiolipin, protein that the inner membrane's meant to be made of in the mitochondria. So those protein complexes drift apart. You cannot tunnel electrons through those protein complexes anywhere near as well. The further apart they go, it's called heteroplasmy rate. And that is part of what makes people sick. But the fourth protein is what is the terminal electron acceptor from oxygen. And so, of course, our body's going to change the way it's breathing at nighttime, and it's not going to hit a parasympathetic state if it's going to be bringing in more oxygen, if it can't even be accepted properly by that terminal electron acceptor. Interestingly, that acceptor works really well with red light exposure. It wants red light. The first couple of electron chain protein complexes, they work with NAD and FAD particularly. They are UV light acceptors. And again, like it doesn't matter which part of our body we look at, there is interrelationships with light that if left unaddressed will make people sick. And it's not, if you look at the light first, as I said, everything else kind of comes into place. I feel like it's easier to work with posture. It's easier to work with breath because you're not getting a disarray of signaling. If you've got light exposure still happening at nighttime, your breath rate has to match more that you're doing something, even, as I said, one little photon of light. And so working with breath is incredibly powerful. And if you're still getting incorrect light cues, morning and or light, you're still going to be tapped out or capped on your ability to be able to maybe get to the place where you feel like you'd really like to meet in yourself. Does that make sense?
So what do you think in terms of like biohacking and like infrared saunas, red lights? What, like some people obviously they kind of need some tools to move from point, A to point B. Like what would you recommend first? Obviously, change of mindset and understanding, but where would people go initially? Like, I mean, obviously everyone's different, but what things would you suggest?
Totally. And, I still find it an amazing thing about the human psychological system that if we spend money on it, then we think it's much more important. I just want to remind everyone, I will offer suggestions, but you can't biohack your way out of natural light. It's just not
Yeah.
possible. You cannot get all of the same wavelengths. And so how to biohack your way into somewhat better mitochondrial function, skin function, nervous system function would be to use red and infrared light in an indoor environment to offset the amount of blue, or to use filters. Like I've got the iris filter on my laptop, like I've got my blue light turned right down. It does change contrast a little bit. And I've obviously got my, I've got these from blockbluelight.com.au. I think Viva Rays and Bond Charge are also really good. So, there's some mitigation strategies for helping handle how much blue light there is. As I mentioned, it's also the angle of the overhead light. If you can match it as closely as possible to what your natural environment is doing between dawn, solar, noon, and dusk, it will serve your body better. Cold therapy is fantastic for mitochondrial function. A lot of people, I feel like, are really tapped out in their nervous system. They're already pretty overwhelmed and they're already pretty exhausted. And if it's a woman, if you've got thyroid dysfunction and you're menstruating, please don't go hard or go home with cold therapy. Cold therapy is as simple as it's less than your body temperature. You want to get uncomfortable in that cold for at least a minute, 2 minutes, 3 minutes. That's great. You don't need to go all the way into an ice bath. And I feel like a lot of people have utilized them in a way that maybe didn't serve their body. They might feel euphoric at the time or straight after an ice bath, and then afterwards be so depleted. So again, I think it's helpful to know where your body's at. Maybe work with a practitioner that understands it. Maybe if you don't understand where your body's at, working with somebody else who might have a bigger lens of where your body could be at, that might be important as well. But you can just do cold therapy by dipping your wrists or your forehead in some water that has ice in it or that's very cold. Our forehead skin, our upper chest skin, the back of our neck, and our wrists will activate cold, responsive communication through our body pretty quickly. And so that can be really helpful. Otherwise, grounding as well. You can get grounding mats for your bed. I always suggest that people just spend more time outside, and the more barefoot or bare skin contact you have. We've got sweat glands on our hands and on our feet that, have this amazing kind of vortex structure that is designed to interact with electron flow directly from Earth. Literally, this is not woo-woo, this is very scientific, but Mother Earth is passing electrons to us all the time. When we have a lot, when we've improved our electron flow in our body, we're kind of unstoppable. we really
Yeah.
are. So there's some strategies to support people. Is there anything else that you feel like? The other thing, actually, I want to just come back into touch. So as a nervous system strategy, whether we're touching ourselves, like stroking movements, tapping ourselves, like there are different ways that we can interact with our nervous system from skin to within that are really, really helpful for, again, like increasing our awareness of ourselves in time and space. The less aware you are, like if you're really caught in your head and you know that you're really thinking a lot and you're doing a lot and you don't even know what your breath is doing, you usually don't know what your feet are doing and you don't really know what your hands are doing. You might be completing tasks, but you kind of don't really know what your body is doing. It's more your head deciding stuff. So anytime you notice you're in that flow, could you just take a pause? You might want to tap. You might just want to notice your feet. You might want to notice your breath. You might just want to quickly stroke your arms. If you're feeling really anxious, even just circling your wrist, there's a whole lot of meridian points that you can activate here while you're breathing. Or you might want to do some sort of bilateral movement, like tapping butterfly taps, one on either side of your chest, or moving, a water bottle from one hand to the other, just to increase your neural connections through your left and right hemisphere of your brain and to connect to more parts of your body. So that will make a really big difference in terms of biohacking your way into your next step.
Yeah, I mean, look, I think everyone needs certain tools to get where they're going. I thought we'd also just discuss quickly the idea of sleep, whether, some people say 8 hours sleep. Some people have this idea that there's, they might have two sleeps where they have a initial, say, 4 hour sleep, then they wake for like a couple of hours and then they sleep after that. The issues where women, say, are breastfeeding. They've got this broken sleep. Some cultures have the culture of napping as well. I mean, how does this all kind of play into the circadian rhythm of the body?
I mean, there's definitely specific chronotypes, and chronotypes can be shifted across your lifespan depending on the choices that you're making. And there are so many different clock gene mechanisms that go into calibrating to our desire for sleep, our melatonin production. I just want to briefly mention here, I'll come back in and finish this question, but our pineal gland, which does make our nighttime melatonin secretion, is not wrapped up in our blood-brain barrier, which means that it gets almost the same amount of blood flow as our kidneys do over the course of the day. It also means that anything that's interacting in our bloodstream, whether that's LPS fragments from, gut inflammation, or, if we've got insulin resistance, insulin's a pretty big protein, or any kind of other inflammatory mediators, it hits straight into our pineal gland. So that can shift someone's chronotype and their rhythms of sleep. Yeah. I mean, obviously if someone's cortisol's elevated, that's also what our pineal gland is listening to, that information, and will suppress melatonin as a result from that. So when people are able to access a well-rested state, whatever they're doing is working for them. If they wake up not feeling very well rested, they haven't had very good sleep. And if they're not able to maintain a pretty harmonious energy over the course of the day, then that might indicate that they also haven't had enough sleep, and that there might be some dysregulations in their system that make them unable to continue with their energy flow over the course of the day. And so I think they're probably the two biggest barometers to look at. Like, is it truly working for you or not?
Yeah, and I think maybe just lastly, touch on hydration, because I think this is a really big thing, and perhaps does going into the full spectrum of light start to regulate that need to, that thirst, like I think the majority of people would be, statistically are chronically dehydrated, and we are not listening to our bodies. And this is where we're kind of tying right back to the start where we started off here is, listen to your body. You
Mm.
know, that as much as you want to listen to us or anyone else, it's like ultimately you've got to take this information, you've got to assimilate it, and you've got to listen to what your body is saying, because everybody is different. And we
Mm.
have lots of underlying things that are similar about each other. And of course, we live on the earth and, you know, we are light beings.
Totally. And so water, like light, has helped our planet evolve, and we did come from water, and we carry water in our body. We are a vessel for water, and in fact we all have a different body shape and a different body size, but we're like a vase and we grow from that. And so we're meant to be about 65% water. So by percentage weight, we are like the greatest amount of water. And interestingly, again, in our mitochondria have a special ability to be able to make water, and that has been very much dismissed with, talks about mitochondria. They're known as like the energy producer of the cell, but people forget about all of the other amazing things that they're doing. One of them is creating intracellular water. So one of the things that people don't realize when they're drinking water is that they might be irrigating their system, but not hydrating their system. And so you could be drinking 3 liters of water a day, but is that water actually getting into your cells? Are your mitochondria actually able to make their own intracellular water? Like, how are those systems working to actually keep you hydrated? When we're dehydrated, it can be that we've had way too much non-native EMF exposure, basically meaning man-made devices. We've had a lot of blue light exposure, so that changes the electron flow in our system. And that can be like one reason that we're dehydrated, let alone whether we haven't even put the water in our mouth. Maybe we've only got coffee going into our system, or Coca-Cola, or whatever it might be. But there's also the shifts in our like municipal water supplies, where there's chlorine and fluoride gone into the water. They both impact our pineal gland, FYI, like they create calcification, but they also create microbiome disturbances as well, which can impact our circadian rhythms. So if you can filter your water, that's amazing, because if you don't, you end up being the filter. And I think that that's a really important thing to recognize. I also think it's really important to come back into a sacred understanding of water, that water is the gift of life. And in fact, we've got water in our skin and in our eyes, and the light interacts a lot with also the water components, and so we need light and we need water for our best life. And the other thing that helps water come into our system heaps better is minerals. So mineralizing your water, I often recommend Quinton minerals, which is kind of like a sea plasma. It's incredibly effective for helping to hydrate a system that has been unable to get water into their system. So that's just, one little handy hint. But you can use really good quality Himalayan rock salt, Celtic sea salt. Himalayan rock salt has had a lot of different controversies because it's become so popular in the world. There's a lot of fake Himalayan salts now that have had heavy metal detections. When it comes to water, also, I do want to point out that if people do have heavy metal load, toxin load, pathogen load, viral load, any load that's not serving their body, water is one of the most important features of how we can deal with that load as well. And the reason why is because when we drink tap water, that is completely different to what optimally our body would like to be doing with water, which is actually making something called structured water or biocellular water. We make that the easiest under red and infrared light, particularly longer length infrared light wavelengths, which are available free from the sun all day, every day. Of course, you can use an infrared sauna or an infrared light device, but it's free for you all day in the sun. That helps to structure the water in your system. Mitochondria also produce infrared light. They're structuring their own water if they're working really well. When water is structured, it is much better able to separate charge. It kind of becomes like a battery in our body. So we've got better energy, better cell communication, but it also pushes out things that don't belong. So it could, block viruses, heavy metals. Like, it's easier for our body to excrete them and let them go. I haven't spoken about deuterium, but I also, just for anybody that knows much about water or mitochondrial function or food choices, deuterium is part of how water can work in our body. When we have deuterium accumulation in our system, then that can be a problem. For people who've never heard that word, deuterium, it's basically an isotope of hydrogen. So you might have heard of hydrogen. It's the very first element on the periodic table. It's the most simple one. It's got a proton and an electron, but deuterium is a little bit different. It's like basically the twin of hydrogen, and it also has a neutron. So that neutron changes its mass. So it's almost the same, but its mass is double the size of hydrogen. Now, we have the most amount of hydrogen atoms in our body by far. It's like a very light, gaseous element. So by weight, it doesn't really add up, but by, count of atoms, we are absolutely hands down the most hydrogen. Deuterium is naturally in our planet, but on really small amounts. But the higher carb food people eat, the more grains people eat, the more processed foods people eat, the more seed oils people eat, they're going to increase their deuterium load in their system. Now, because of deuterium's greater mass, it's heavier. It's harder for cells to do things and to organize and to get rid of it. Basically, it's very heavy. So when it's moving through the mitochondrial electron transport chain, for instance, it's so heavy that it really mucks around with that ATP synthase, that turbine motor that we need to spin really fast to produce ATP, like the energy currency of our cells. So if we've got a deuterium accumulation coming through the electron transport train, blocking up the ATP synthase, that's one of the reasons why people feel tired, fatigued, they can't quite get their energy, going. They're going to put on weight faster at this point. So the more fat we have, the less water we have. And part of that is related to, light exposure. Part of that's related to mitochondrial function. Part of that's related to deuterium accumulation. And so when it comes to drinking water, being aware of your water source can be really helpful. If it's spring water, glacial water, they tend to be very naturally low in deuterium. I feel like unfiltered tap water is probably one of the worst waters that we can drink, and another way that I feel like keeps people not living their best life.
Yeah, low vibrational state. And of course, we're also bathing in that water that's affecting, the skin and our ability to absorb vitamin D and create it and all of
And
that.
our thyroid gland,
Thyroid. I mean, there are other things, that I mean, myself personally, water fasting I found to be a way that I've been able to restore balance in my body. But also because a lot of the energy is then just transferred into actual healing. And then for some reason, I think you sort of stop feeling thirsty, but then after a water fast, I'll just reset all of that ability to, you detoxify and you end up with quite a high amount of energy. So it's interesting. Some of the old ways of how people were doing things are very natural. You go out and get sun exposure. I mean, literally, if someone wants a really big reset, they go on a holiday, right? In a way, they take time out of their normal life, and then they do the daily walks, get out into the sun in the right
What,
times.
what they're changing though is their light exposure and their EMF exposure generally. Like
Yeah.
those two factors, when people go on holiday and they feel really good, some people go to the forest or the mountains and they're still getting lots of infrared light exposure as well as natural light exposure. Some people go to the beach. When you're in the water, you're receiving a lot more electron flow. Or if you're in a lake in the mountains, you're also, or at a waterfall, you're receiving a lot more electron flow in your system. So you're helping to stabilize your electron flow. That is the gift of life. If we can't move electrons down that electron transport chain, if those electrons can't meet oxygen, gone.
Yeah, and I think, if you're chronically ill, you really have to kind of be focused on these kind of things and how much self-love and attention you're going to place on your life in order to get through over that hump to get well. Because I think there's that kind of, it's a bit of a mountain to climb when you're quite sick in order to get and see those results. But once you get to that top of that mountain, it's kind of like downhill all the way. So
And you mentioned it at the beginning, Jeannie, and it's also just beginning with gratitude. So it might, for some people, feel really challenging to thank their body for where it's at right now if they're not really appreciating it. However, I believe that our bodies are always doing the best that they can with the resources that they have at the time and the resources that they've been given previously. And for whatever reason, like our birth story, our conception story, our birth story, our childhood story, our teenage stories, like I get it. Like there's a lot of different reasons that go into a body that moves, that has to move into a trauma response at some stage. I also believe that through our greatest pain, we find our greatest light. Because we're prepared often to make dramatic shifts in our choices. And one of those shifts, if it can be reconnecting to self and just recognizing, like, I'm so grateful for you, body. I know that you're doing the best that you can. I'm doing the best that I can to forge a new relationship with you. I'm doing the best that I can to listen to my own heartbeat and to work with my own breath. I'm doing the best that I can to unlock tension through my feet, through my fascia, through my diaphragm, through my shoulders, so that we can work together better, so that I'm more aligned in my posture, so that my inner formation serves me more for a healthier life. I'm working on feeling safer and more grounded in my body. Like those kind of affirmative statements
Mm.
where you are really offering your body like, oh, I see you, I hear you, I feel you. That's all any of us ever want, to feel that's, again, in a trauma response, we don't feel supported, we don't feel seen, we don't feel heard. We, like something's happened where there's been a rupture, and then we then manifest that rupture inside our organ systems where we're not actually seeing or feeling or hearing ourselves anymore. So in a healing journey, I do believe that it's very, very powerful to start working with our system in a way where there's a felt sense of gratitude coming in. And this is where the skin stroking again, like, just touching our skin can be very, very healing. We don't even need anyone else to be there. And often we attach so many needs onto other people, so many attachments to expectations and outcomes. We feel disappointed because other people haven't been there for us. And when we turn that lens around on ourselves, and when we're pointing a finger at other people and there's one finger pointed and your thumbs up, I mean, you look at those three fingers pointing back, and I kind of am like, well, I've got triple the load there. There's triple amounts of responsibility and empowerment that I can choose here. So when I do choose to, every time, I've been through some deep healing processes where I've had to really disentangle myself from my needs and expectations from others. And every time I looked at them for not doing something for me, I was like, oh, isn't that interesting? Was I doing that for me? Have I been
Mm.
showing up for myself in exactly that way that I want someone else to? And I get that co-regulation with our community is really important, but if we're not prepared to take those steps for ourselves, then it's not fair to place that burden on other people because they've got their own shit going on. you know?
Yeah, and I think that's that sign of acceptance. Like often when, say, someone is confronted with, say, chronic illness or any diagnosis whatsoever, there's that all that why did it happen to me? That guilt. What did I do wrong? Is it this or that? And then there's kind of this desperate search for finding the answers. And then I think it's where you kind of get to that point where you just sit in yourself and you just accept, this is the position that I'm in, but I'm going to recover. I'm going to find my way. This is my opportunity, if you like. I had that opportunity when I was diagnosed in 2022, heart failure, 15%. All the doctors are there trying to put me into panic mode. And I just thought, no, this is my opportunity to recover and help others to recover. And because I had that mindset, even from day one, I felt fine, and I made the recovery, and I was able to listen and tap into what I needed to do. And I think this is where it's very difficult because there's a lot of overlap with all our lives, but there's not necessarily a roadmap that I could give to somebody that would fix them, because everyone's different, right?
Yeah,
Like,
I say this all the time, N equals 1. Honestly, I read scientific journals, or like I'm so invested in like learning, studying, understanding. I love it. It is my whole entire life. And what I realize over and over again is that N equals 1. And you know why? Like your mitochondria are different to mine. Your heart size is different to mine. Like even the length of your digestive system, like how you chew your food, how you interact with the light, like all of that is really specific to you. I want to honor you also for having that inner narrative. And I do really want to bring up how important that inner narrative is. Whatever story is consistently being heard in your inner voice in your head, that is your truth, that is your current belief, that is the current physiology and psychology that you will maintain. So I do work on something, one of my great friends, Alex Tripod, calls it the magical script. I activate a magical script with my clients. It doesn't matter how simple it is, as long as it's meaningful to the person. Like I am working towards living my best life. I'm becoming my best version of myself. I'm forging this deeper, intimate relationship with myself. I mean, my magical script is related to how I'm able to use my intelligence to be able to serve other people and to light up their lives. And as I see them light up, it lights me up even more and it keeps me going on that path. Like I have created these scripts that I reiterate. It's rote learning over and over and over again. I have embedded what it is that I want to hear. And I want to share with everyone that my old script used to be so freaking mean. I was just never nice to myself. I was so mean. And I understand that that's a protective strategy from a really overtapped nervous system. And it does have a place and there is some healing. But I also spent so long in trauma healing. I was so obsessed with feeling all the pain and unpacking and unraveling all the trauma that, I lived across my lifespan, that I also forgot to embrace and practice joy and ease and pleasure. And because I forgot to practice those things, they were still much less familiar to my body. If it's less familiar, it's less energy efficient to go down that pathway. Our body wants to choose the path of most familiar because it's more energy efficient. And so if we're going to change our path, we need to create familiarity with the things that we're calling in. So sometimes it's just starting off with the words. Then I ask people to try on those words like they're trying on a jumper. How does it feel? Can you celebrate that feeling? Like if you had that right now, would you be feeling, how would your posture be in your body? What would your tone of voice be? Would you be looking at me? Would you be smiling? Would you be like opening up? Like where in your body are you feeling that? And can you just practice that right now? If you've practiced it right now, you know you can do it. And would you be able to practice that 10 more times tomorrow, 20 more times the next day? Could you just bring that in to your life to allow familiarity with the ease, the flow, the grace? And it's definitely been one of the ways that I've been able to extract myself from my, I guess they call it an addiction to pain and suffering, where I didn't know how to actually be without that. It's almost like I had a belief that things had to be hard for it to be worthy of anything.
Yeah.
Now I'm very, very attuned to, I love feeling more joy and openness and expansion in my life. I love being able to be curious rather than myopic. If I'm not able to ask myself a question or notice, like, isn't that interesting that I've had that response? I wonder how that came up or what led me to that. Or, can I ask myself some open-ended questions about what led me to this point? Can I ask open-ended questions of other people? Curiosity is also how we can imagine and dream and grow and evolve. If we're not curious, if we're not open to expanding our perspective, then we're going to stay stuck in our current paradigm, our current container, our current boundaries.
Yeah, and I think it's really important that just people listening here today can feel your energy, Pia, and the joy that you bring to healing. And I think this is why I often, you can get really stressed when you see some medical professionals because they're still stuck in a very trauma response. So they're projecting a lot of their trauma from the work that they do onto you with a very negative, kind of, we're going to find out what's wrong with your body, as opposed to making your story. This is my story and this is my future. I'm going to create, and my body is going to come into alignment with that story. And it does in such amazing ways. Our body and our minds are incredibly powerful to create that story of empowerment and healing and connection to the earth and everything. So have we covered everything? We have covered so much today. I just want to give you a shout out that your website is kynoch.com.
And you can find
You
me
have
on social media,
Instagram,
Pia the Spiritual Naturopath.
LinkedIn and Facebook, is that right? And you've got a YouTube channel as well.
Yeah, I do. And I would love some more YouTube subscribers in particular. If anyone's enjoyed listening to this, if I get over 100 subscribers, which I haven't done enough videos on there, and I would love to share more, but it just means that I can go live on that channel. So please hit me up on YouTube.
Yeah, and also you offer is it counseling?
So I do one-on-one client sessions. I also have a library. I have classes. I've got classes on light and water and mitochondrial function. I've got a number of different things in my library that students can access starting today if they wanted to, including nervous system regulation. And I do look after clients one-on-one and I mentor other practitioners. So yeah, there's a number of different ways in which I love to work with people. And I also love offering breathwork journeys. I know we haven't spoken about breathwork that much, but yeah, I literally have so many different tools that I can pull from, depending on, where the excitement is taking me. But I literally, any part of health, wellbeing and wellness that I can support, either an individual or a group or a community with, I am, open to listening to what those ideas are.
You're amazing, Pia. I mean, the wealth of knowledge, that you've brought together here, tying in the scientific with the holistic understanding of light. It's just been such a pleasure to have you. So we're going to have Pia's on our channel, Health Alliance Australia. You'll find links to all of her channels and her website on the website healthalliance.org.australia. Please subscribe to our mailing list. We're also on LinkedIn mostly. You can find me, and I think you're also on LinkedIn as well.
Yeah, I never. So I need, some things in my life that I let slide at different times. That's one of them.
Yeah, so do come along and also check out some of our other videos. We've sort of designed our videos to be more ageless in a sense that they're not necessarily tied to the news cycle. And this particular one is going to be another ageless episode, because you'll be able to pull this same video up in 10 years time, and it'll still apply, because the earth was not going to change all that much in 10, 20, 100 years time. So thanks so much for your time, Pia. And yeah, subscribe everyone and join our mailing list. Support Pia and her work if you like. Yeah, great.
And the last thing I just want to end with is just to I want to remind everyone that you are a light being. You are designed to interact with light. It is the fundamental foundational piece from which you can grow and evolve and flourish, literally just like a plant. And just being able to take ownership of your interactions with natural light will provide you so many benefits, in my opinion. And so just as one strategy to begin with on any journey, or wherever you are in the journey, that's a huge one to be able to implement. So good luck, everyone, and thanks for listening.
Okay, thanks.